You lost your coffee.
All right, folks. Thank you very much. You certainly could see why Juliet Kayyem is such an extraordinary and valuable member of this faculty, but also an asset to the country. I don't know how many of you were watching the various programming during the Boston Marathon bombing, but it was part of the way I would describe it is much of the programming was making wild generalizations, leaps, just completely out of control. And then every so often, Juliet would come on, and she'd say, "Okay, let's calm down here. Here's the facts. Let's not go beyond what we know," and so forth. So it's a great thing. We now have a unique treat because we have someone who is back here for his reunion, but is also engaged in other fairly substantial activities during the times when he's not in his reunion. We're here with Vuk Jeremić, who is one of the most prominent graduates of this school. Vuk is the president of the 67th session of the United States General Assembly. And he is one of the most, he's unusual in many different respects. First of all, he's one of the first presidents of the General Assembly who actually ran for the office. Typically, it goes from region. There's like 5 regions, and each year a kind of region picks one. You're president of the General Assembly for a year. He decided he actually wanted to run and not let the region just pick it, and he ran in an election. It was a secret election held in the General Assembly, and I think he won 99 to 88 or some such thing. So it's truly an amazing story, and from that, by the way, comes a kind of legitimacy that one might not otherwise get if you were the sort of choice of one block of folks and so forth. Prior to that, he'd been Minister of Foreign Affairs for Serbia from 2007 to 2012. He was certainly playing a leader role in securing official EU candidacy for his country, advancing reconciliation efforts. Most interestingly, though, he was, prior to the downfall of the Milosevic regime and so forth, he was a member of the opposition, or even the resistance, as they called themselves. So he's no stranger to what it's like to deal with authoritarian regimes and to come to some other kinds of resolution. And the other interesting feature, though, is he's got rather unusual training, or had unusual training for that, because I think you, as I recall, you got a degree in physics as an undergraduate, and theoretical physics, or mathematical physics or something like that. And then you were doing math in London. But we won't stop the story. But in any case, then at some point he comes to the Kennedy School, gets an MPID in 2003, goes back and is appointed advisor for foreign affairs to the Minister of Defense. And in 2004, he became senior foreign policy advisor to the President of Serbia, and continuing in that capacity his position of foreign minister in 2007. So right out of here, he quickly became and rose to these positions. So again, his bachelor degree is in theoretical physics from Cambridge University. And so it's my enormous pleasure and urge you to welcome Vuk Jeremić, President of the 67th General Assembly. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask some questions and so on, and then we'll obviously open up to the audience. But one of my questions is sort of like, you're doing math in London, right? And you're involved in financial services. And the next thing we know, you're here in the MPID program. What happened?
Well, one can say that it was a moment of clarity and a long-term vision, like look what's going on in the world of finance these days. But the real answer to that is, first of all, I got to ask if everybody's hearing this okay. Is everything fine? Great. That's the one thing that you know about a public appearance that you always want to check out first if people can hear you. Well, it was a very difficult year, '99. When I came here, it was a very difficult year back home. A war was going on, and the big problem at that time in Serbia was that opposition to our dictatorship was hopelessly fragmented. And when I came to visit some friends who were doing math at the MIT here, we came for a party, actually. Here at the Kennedy School, believe it or not.
There are parties at the Kennedy School, you may.
Most of those people were from the business school at the time, but it was here in the grounds of the Kennedy School. So, believe it or not, the big thing about international affairs at the time was the Balkans. And people talked about the Balkans. It was after the war in 1999, and a lot of interesting things at the time were going on in that part of the world. I was part of the opposition movement. It was called the Resistance. We are actually with a capital R. It was a resistance. We were an underground movement. I did live in London, but I was traveling very frequently to Serbia, and I was making contacts between our resistance group and various governments abroad. That was actually my job within the resistance. And then some people here, we had a very successful program dealing with the Southeast Europe at the time. It was called the Kokkalis program. People who were running Kokkalis program at the time, they started asking me questions about what's going on in Serbia. Is there any hope to overthrow Slobodan Milošević there, and so on and so forth. And I then started explaining to them how this opposition is fragmented and so on and so forth. And they said, like, well, but what would happen if we invite every single of those opposition leaders to come to the Kennedy School to be part of an event at the Kennedy School? And they said, well, that could theoretically work. After they realized that everybody else was invited as well, it may be a little bit more difficult, but let me try and deal with it. Actually, the invitation of the Kennedy School was so powerful that every single of the opposition leaders in Serbia accepted it. So on this very stage, in April 2000, there was the first collective appearance of the Serbian opposition. And that's not an exaggeration. It was actually the first time that they were sitting in the same place, and they were sitting here at this stage. I helped organize this with good friends from the Kokkalis Foundation, and the dean at the time, he was sitting here and interviewing them, and actually after that common appearance, collective appearance here, they went on and managed to create a coalition in Serbia. Now, sounds like a fairy tale story. It was really like that. And I'm not trying to make any parallels between Serbia and any other country of today, or fragmented opposition of Serbia at a time, or fragmenting opposition of any country of today. But there are there are elements of similarity which may be used. Maybe the Kennedy School.
I want to emphasize the Kennedy School's mission is not primarily a regime change, though we are often pleased when
I'm not in the business of regime change for this 1 year either.
But you're okay. So you made this. You helped put together this panel. You think it was instrumental in ultimately the Milosevic's departure. So then you what?
And then we actually made it. Milosevic was overthrown a few months later, 6 months later, and I became a part of the first democratic government of Serbia. That's where I understood that I was not going to go back to the world of finance, and that's when I decided that I want to go and try and learn something about what I'm going to do in my future life, and that's how I came to the Kennedy School, and that's how I joined the MPID program.
That's amazing.
And that's when I got Jeff Sachs to be my advisor, and 10 years later, now he's my advisor. So the situation changed. He's now my advisor. I was, and it's a different.
All right. So you get your MPID. You go back to Serbia, and tell us now then how you rose so quickly, and in a very short time was the youngest foreign minister in Europe.
It's such a great thing that people still keep calling me young, because
yeah. I remember when people say, "I expected someone older." That doesn't happen anymore. Yeah.
Do you know what? Like 5, 6 years ago, when I became foreign minister at the age of 32, I used it as the advantage, because when you enter the room and you start speaking with a foreign minister, he really gets stunned, but he then tends to listen to you a little bit more carefully, because you're, exotic to him, because you're so young, and I'm still in this young business, being the youngest president of the General Assembly
there you go,
ever.
absolutely.
But after 6 years, you no longer feel that you're so young. So first of all, thank you for the compliment. In Serbia, when you're in elected politics, when you run for office, then one thing just comes after another, and so was the situation in Serbia. I decided to run early on, and I decided to run for the president of the General Assembly when not too many people expected that there was going to be an elective bid. Well, in this country, it happens quite often.
And then, so you're foreign minister, and you were foreign minister during some pretty remarkable times. Now, just again a little bit by way of background, we had a 20th anniversary of the Kokeles program some years back, and this is a program that included, unfortunately, Kokeles program no longer exists, but it was a program for students from Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, and the Balkans broadly. So we had people from Greece and Turkey and Serbia and Croatia and Bosnia. You can get the rough sense of the region. It was created by someone who Socrates Kokeles, who had been a refugee after World War II and wanted to figure out a way to bring these countries together. He came to the obvious insight that they had more in common than differences, and created this program, and it's been enormously successful. And indeed, one of the things that I talk about is when we had this huge reunion in Athens. Luke was actually the speaker, and it was astonishing to see these leaders from all of these other countries who were just thrilled to see the foreign minister of Serbia and give him big hugs and so forth, because certainly to the outward world at the time, it was, ooh, Serbia, this is difficult relationships. And again, I think it shows how important relationships that you build up at places like this really can be. So it's really true. But again, you were there during, Serbia obviously has a complicated history. There are events around Kosovo. Tell us a little bit about what were the biggest challenges during your period there, and what were the things you're most proud of?
Well, what was definitely the most challenging thing was to be the foreign minister of Serbia at the time of the declaration of secession of a part of the Serbian territory. And, you know, by definition, that becomes a very big issue in a country where such a thing takes place. I think that the Serbian government of the time, and I was part of this government, and that's probably something that I can easily say that I'm most proud of, was that this was the first time in the history of the Balkans that an issue of such significance, an issue of such complexity, involving at the same time boundaries, opposing historical narratives, security, different ethnic and religious identities, it did not end up in a war. The Kosovo's unilateral declaration of secession in the year 2008 was the first development in the Balkans of such significance. Regardless of what I think of it or somebody else may think of it, it was the first time that an issue of such significance took place in the Balkans and there was not a war over it. And it was a conscious decision by the government of Serbia to use exclusively diplomatic tools to push for our point of view, which some people agreed with and some people disagreed with, but it was only diplomacy that we used. Now, by definition, if you decide only to use diplomacy, it means that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is somehow at the forefront of these efforts. And that ended up being the biggest challenge. And I'm proud of the way we've done. We've kept peace. We have kept our position on Kosovo very firm and strong and constitutional, and we haven't changed it. But there's a peace in the Balkans. There is a continued process of EU integration in the Balkans, despite everything that is going on in the EU and the difficulties that Europe is currently going through. I mean, Europe is going through a very difficult time right now. But we've kept peace, we've kept direction, and I think that we have raised to such prominence in diplomatic terms that at the moment when we decided to run for the post of the President of the General Assembly as a country that has decided to do this for the first time in good 20 years, we've had that level of recognition in the international community that we had actually managed to win this global vote. So that's possibly what I was proudest of, that I was a part of a government that managed to keep peace. And that's not a small order in the Balkans.
Yeah. Let's now move to the UN General Assembly. Your term is 2/3 over, I guess, or something like that. And you've really taken the job very, very seriously. And again, it's sort of astonishing the things you've done. Tell me, the UN and the UN General Assembly is often perceived as not very effective, or tell me the issues you focused on. How have you tried to really use the UN, and where do you see the real strength and the power within the UN in terms of what it can do for the world?
Well, number one, you're right. It's not terribly efficient an organization, and there is now a big effort to try and change this organization. And these months, I mean, it is becoming very obvious. I mean, from time to time, it does become obvious that things are not working very well. And the Syria crisis has made it very, very clear and manifest to everybody that, certain things perhaps need to change because the system is paralyzed. That's first and foremost to do with the Security Council, but there are other parts of the United Nations other than the Security Council, believe it or not, although the Security Council is taking up most of the international attention. In order to change things, you first and foremost need to start openly talking about the fact that things are not going well. And for a long time, presidents of the General Assembly, we're not talking about this. And I was also very strongly advised not to talk about it. But you know, there's one position in the system of the United Nations that you can't change, and that's the President of the General Assembly. I've studied very carefully the rules of procedure and the UN Charter, and you can't actually, there is no way in which you can impeach the President of the General Assembly. So that's it. So when I realized that, and you can get reelected.
Right.
So I decided to take this job very seriously. And I first and foremost started organizing thematic debates in the General Assembly. This is something very similar to like Senate hearings, which is you select a topic and you believe that there is something important that you need to discuss in public, that you need to discuss in open, and then you start sending out invitation to relevant individuals for this. And you pick topics. We picked, in this presidency, some topics that were never discussed in the UN before, in the General Assembly open format. We, for example, called for a debate on international criminal tribunals. A very delicate issue. You'd be surprised how many people have different points of view on a number of tribunals that we've had in the past and the ones that we have right now. It ended up being the biggest debate in the history of the UN. It took place last month. Then another interesting debate we're having next week, and that's the debate on climate change. Believe it or not a single time in the UN General Assembly an issue of climate change was raised. This is going to be the first time. You have special arrangements where the climate negotiations are taking place. These are called COP, the climate change negotiations. I said to everybody, listen, this issue of climate change has become so geopolitical in nature that unless you bring it to the UN, where the world of diplomacy is sitting together, I mean, how do you think this is going to be resolved? I used my experience as foreign minister of Serbia. As a foreign minister, I had no clue about the position of Serbia in the negotiations on climate change because it was done by the Ministry of Environment. Now, Serbia is not the best organized country in the world, but it's not the worst organized either, trust me. So a number of times, a foreign minister would come to me and said, Mr. Minister, we would really appreciate, if you could help this and this in the climate change negotiations. And I'd say, of course. Later on to realize that the Minister of Environment is telling me, are you crazy? This is not our position. We're having it totally opposite. I'm saying, why? He said, it's too complicated. I can't explain to you. This is just... Honestly, on the 4th of December of last year, there was a big round of climate change negotiations in Doha. And I said to the climate change conference organizers that I would like to go there and to speak, to address them. After 3 weeks, I realized that they actually don't want to have me there because there were so many obstructions in the organizing of my... And I only wanted to go there to invite them to come for this public hearing, for this public debate that I'm organizing next week. You know, it took me to say that I will organize on the same day a General Assembly discussion on how inefficient the COP negotiations are. Honestly, that's how I got the invitation. Anyway, I went there to Doha and I said to them, guys, you're doing something very, very important. I don't say that I understand, and it's really complicated and it's a really valiant thing that you're doing. Now, do you realize that 85% of us in the UN, we don't have a first clue as to what's going on there. Please come. Let's have a debate. Hey, maybe we're not going to change anything. It's not a turf war. It's not that we're going to try and take away this from you and bring it to the General Assembly. We just need a better understanding of a geopolitical issue of our time. So we're going to have it next Thursday, this coming Thursday. Another important thematic debate that we've organized, and this is the first time, again, on the relationship between the G20 and the UN. You know, G20 is an organization that has, that has taken prominence since 2008 at some point. A lot of people believe that their action led to the stopping of the world economic crisis at a time. Now, the problem, like with most other international organizations other than the UN, is that there are a lot of people in the UN who are deeply suspicious about the G20. I just realized, for example, that the G20 is not mentioned in any single UN document. There is no mention of G20 because there are countries who are preventing the mentioning of the G20, saying, who are they, G20? Why is it 20 and not 25? And who gave them the right to make decisions? But the reality of the world is that these guys are there, these guys are powerful, they meet regularly, and from time to time they make decisions that are felt by everybody in the whole world. So my point was, why don't we make an interaction mechanism between the 20 and the rest of the world? And that happened for the first time. That happened for the first time this year. So that was an interesting thing. And the last debate, I mean, there's so many interesting things to be mentioned. But the last thematic debate that we are going to hold in the General Assembly, and I'm sure that there are going to be a lot of people being, sweating and scratching their heads. But in the last week of the presidency of the General Assembly, of the 67th presidency of the General Assembly, we're going to organize a public hearing on the role of the credit rating agencies in the in the world economic crisis. And one of my classmates from here is going to be a moderator for that, and we're expecting this to be a very exciting event. But in short, I'm not going to be reelected. That's why I have decided to, really go for it. They can't impeach me, so what the heck. I think it went well, and I think that after this, my successor, it's going to come from Latin America, and the Latin American group has decided, years ago on who's going to be this. But the one after me is coming from Africa. There are a number of African ministers who have decided to run in an election for this. I think it may very well be the case that after the 67th presidency, this is no longer going to be an appointed position, but there's always going to be a very difficult run, an election. And if this ends up being transformational to the point that people start caring about this position, to the point that they want to go and run for it, if that's the only thing that I've left behind me, I'd be very, very proud.
That's great. So,
Thank you.
in a moment, we're going to open up for questions, but I want to ask you one last obvious question that a dean would only ask. But what things happened at the Kennedy School that you have found to be valuable?
Valuable?
Mm-hmm.
People. Number one, and number two, and number three, people. The people who I met there, and some of them are today in this room. Not only my classmates have made such a transformational impact on me. They have become a part of who I am, and my thinking has become a part of. My thinking was also very, very strongly influenced. And here in the school, everybody talks about leadership and how individual leadership can make a difference. Some of us take it seriously. You end up then having problems with people who are teaching you that this is the great thing, and you have started doing it too much. Too much individual leadership. But anyhow, this truly has changed my life. These 2 years at the Kennedy School have changed my life. And I've met the people who have ended up being the most important individuals in my life. And that's the thing that I will, I'm sure, say at the next reunion and the one after next.
And you've been a very you've always come to the reunion, so we're especially thrilled about that. All right, I want to open up the questions, and there are again 4 microphones. Just a reminder, please identify yourself, keep it short, and make sure it's a question. Right over here.
Thank you, Mr. President. My name is Bill McCamley. I'm a MPP from 2003 and currently a member of the New Mexico State House of Representatives. I didn't think I would be coming here asking you a question until 2 months ago when I sit on our Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and a representative actually came up with a bill that was, if it would have passed, required the state to not allow cities and counties to follow the UN Agenda 21 Sustainability Project. I thought this was a joke until I actually did some research on this and found out that the state of Alabama passed a bill requiring their cities and counties to not follow the Agenda 21 Sustainability Project. So I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about what the UN is doing regarding sustainability internationally, why it's important. And I would love to go back home with your personal assurance that the UN is not using these sorts of strategies to send in their black helicopters and take over the world.
Listen, this is actually, I personally believe that this is the most important part of the UN's work for the decades to come, to introduce sustainability in the way we're going to develop in the future. What's really shocking is that this kind of thing, I mean, I was aware of this kind of thinking because I'm also talking to you know, my colleagues from the United States mission in the United Nations. But it is really shocking that the reservation skepticism actually comes in such a strong way from both the developing and the developed. You know, I'll give you a point of view of, let's say, a typical African or Asian countries that are now having development, they're having growth, and it is doing well, and that it is doing much better than in the past. And now all of a sudden there is this discussion on sustainable development. The way, for example, a developing country would reason is, why is it that they want to impose these strictures? They have developed themselves using industrialization, carbon intensive industries, and so on and so forth. They want to now impose on us constraints so that we can catch up with them. They're telling us you can't burn carbon anymore. So fine, if you don't want us to burn carbon, are you prepared to share with us your green technologies? We can pay these green technologies, but can you actually share this with us if you insist that we are not continue destroying the environment? Anyway, these are the two extreme positions. Unfortunately, some of the most extreme positions come from the United States. That's unfortunate because the United States is one of the most developed countries in the world and a country that is a natural candidate for leadership in an issue of international significance. However, when it comes to sustainable development, the United States is not a leader. Is not a leader in today's world. It is possibly because of the domestic politics that you are describing, and domestic politics in the United States is getting more and more convoluted and complicated these days, at least to an outsider. But I think that if there is no clear leadership on the issue of sustainable development for the next couple of months and years, we're going to wait for the year 2015, the year when the Millennium Development Goals expire, with no international agenda set up. The Rio Plus 20 conference that was held last June in Rio de Janeiro, a very ambitious project, pulled by the Brazilians. Brazil demonstrated great leadership in this regard, and everybody is very grateful for Brazil for this. has produced a document that has to be implemented in the United Nations system to create the post-2015 development agenda that is going to be general, that it is going to be accepted by everybody, that it is going to involve the constraints, environmental and social constraints, sustainability constraints to the future development. If we don't pull it in the next couple of years, and it is only through the UN that this process can be legitimized. The Millennium Development Goals, if you remember, you were in 2003 here, so we were talking about them. The Millennium Development Goals were parachuted, were given to the member states of the United Nations. They were written up by experts, clever experts, but they were written up by experts and imposed on the member states. But that was a different time. 2003 is a very different time from the 2013. You can't any longer impose any piece of paper on anybody in the UN in 10 years down the road. So we are basically tasked with writing up the Sustainable Development Agenda. It has to come bottom up, not top down. And if there is no clear leadership in this process, it's going to be very, very hard. Unfortunately, America is missing from the picture when it comes to sustainable development. And that's a very, very sad part of today's reality in the United Nations.
Great. Right over here.
Can you hear me? Bing Lanxu, mid-career 2008. Would you tell us more about this dialogue between G20 and the non-G20 nations? I'm asking this because, for a start, it's difficult to have a single voice from the G20, and it could be even difficult to have a single voice for the non-G20 nations. Would you tell us more about how did it go? Thanks.
Well, you know, the biggest problem with the G20 is the fact that some countries inside the 20, they believe that they shouldn't be talking to anybody outside. Well, they half hate the fact that there are 20 of them, that they even hate the fact that they need to talk to all the 20, let alone the 173 that are out of those 20. But you know, there is an equally strong opposition from some of the, I would say, hardline anti-globalist member states of the United Nations. Cuba, for example, or Venezuela, you know, that are just saying like, whoever is trying to present himself as a G20 something can speak in the UN. You can speak as United States or China or France, but not as a representative of the G20, because that's not a legitimate body. And the fact that I advocated the G20 entry into the General Assembly helped bridge these differences. Because I was strongly supported by the non-aligned. I was strongly supported by the third world. I was voted in office as a candidate of the developing world. So when I came to them and I said, listen, do you think that I'd be a Trojan horse of a G20? They believed it, and they allowed it for the first time that the discussion takes place. It actually turned out to be a very constructive discussion. And we had the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago saying, yes, we want to talk to you as a Caribbean community, as a group of developing states. We want to talk to you. We want you to listen to us, the G20, when we tell you what is our view on your agenda. And their representative of the G20 was the European Commission President, Barroso. He said, yes, consider yourself invited to the next meeting. Next meeting is in Russia, so there was a discussion with the Russians afterwards, because there was a little bit of a surprise for them that people started getting invited from the floor. I had to do a little bit of talking with the Russians afterwards, but it all actually played out very well. And we are going to have a resolution in the General Assembly to be adopted in the General Assembly, hopefully adopted in the General Assembly next month, in which we are going to codify the way in which the G20 and the UN are going to interact in the future in terms of briefings, invitations, but to have a regularization of the G20 UN relationship. I hope it's going to be adopted. There is this fetish in the UN that things need to be adopted by consensus. They're probably going to try and pull that on me as well this time around, but I'd be ready to go ahead and adopt it by a majority vote if need be.
Right here.
Dobar dan.
Dobar dan.
Kako ste? My name is Simon Holden. I'm from the class of '98. What I wanted to ask is, what is your opinion of NATO's intervention in the Balkans? And what lessons do you think that intervention has or holds for dealing with the situation in Syria?
All right. So this is what I was really hoping I was going to avoid to have to discuss it. The Balkans, but
you could say it's a complicated situation.
No, but like, somebody who keeps saying that like he's a straight shooter, straight talker, the guy, and then now I can't be too diplomatic when it comes to that. I think it was fraught with many mistakes. The intervention, the NATO intervention in the Balkans, and especially the last one, which took place in Kosovo. I think it was a terrible mistake, and we are still suffering from the results of this. We still haven't solved the issue of Kosovo. It's probably going to take us a long while until we get to a full, comprehensive, and stable state solution. But I don't know if the lessons can be drawn for the serious situation. I think that there are more pertinent and more recent memory examples where I think you can try and draw parallels, and that's first and foremost, in my opinion, Iraq and Libya. What was achieved? How was it done? Was there enough planning? Was there enough understanding of what is going on the ground prior to engaging in a military action? I'm afraid that the Balkans is going to be a walk in a park. It's going to look like a walk in a park in comparison to what may happen if there is a hasty decision with respect to military engagement in Syria. But I think that this country has now a well of experience and recent experience when it comes to military engagement in the Middle East and how complicated it may get. I think this is Syria is probably the most complicated one of all. I'm talking about the last 10, 20 years. And I would advise a great deal of caution when it comes to Syria. It's a very, very, very delicate and complicated situation. So making parallels with the Balkans, I don't think it's going to be too helpful. I mean, we can, of course, go in and try and make them, but I think that there are more pertinent parallels to be drawn at this stage. That was the first part of the question. The second part was what?
You answered both. I was just wondering what your...
great.
I suppose, I mean...
Good.
I suppose why what I'm taking from your answer is that these interventions don't work. You obviously thought they didn't work in Serbia.
It certainly didn't work in the Balkans. It didn't work as intended. Let me put it this way. It did not work as intended in the Balkans. That's my opinion, of course. There may be different points of view.
All right,
thank you.
Let's go here.
Good afternoon. Nelson Ranieri, MPA 2, 1993. 1993.
Yeah!
Jeez, tough crowd. Thank you for your leadership by example, for your candor. If it's now your 50th reunion, look forward to the future. I'd be curious, given your vantage point, kind of a best case scenario, worst case scenario, and a most likely scenario for the United States' role in the world.
In the United States, United Nations?
No, United States.
United States' role in the world.
Yeah.
Well, the United States is no doubt it's still the most powerful player in the world. It sits on the Security Council. It has demonstrated strength time and again, and it certainly has I'm talking about international engagement. The United States certainly has the power to destroy anything or anybody in the world, which is a great piece of leverage. If you're in such a position, then you're a very, very significant player. Now, is the United States capable of solving or fixing anything in the world? It's another matter. And the record is not great. The recent record in particular isn't great. So it's the most powerful country, but even the United States can't pull things on its own. And the global challenge, the challenges that we face, even the security challenges in the field where the United States is the undoubted leader, are such that you can't actually pull them alone. So it is to do with the future alliances of the United States, the capacity and the role and the leverage of the United States in the world. The United States, unfortunately, tends to go alone on a number of issues. I'm not talking about the hard peace and security stuff, because in the hard peace and security stuff, you have NATO, you have Pacific allies, and so on and so forth. But let's talk about the other, the sustainable development, the climate change, the world economic affairs. The United States tends to go alone, and I don't think it's a good idea. If there is a continuation of this tendency of going alone, I think that there's going to be a continuing diminishing of the power and the role of the United States in the future. I'm not saying that there's going to be any country that takes over the role of the United States, but it is going to become increasingly difficult for the United States to get its thing through. And in an increasingly democratized world, you know, we're talking about empowerment of peoples. Maybe in the Middle East it is most manifest that people start feeling it's a different world, flow of information, and so on and so forth. It is very, very difficult to keep the lid on democratic aspirations of individuals. But the same thing applies to countries, as a matter of fact. And I see this very well in the General Assembly. I have to say, the United States worked very hard against my election. Very hard. But it was not possible for this to be stopped. Now, this is not the most important position in the world. And after I became the president, I have left this aside, and I'm now working very closely with the United States, because without the United States, you cannot really solve a problem, any problem in the world. But if the United States chooses not to be a part of a solution, it is very, very difficult to envisage a future in which the United States is as important, as relevant as it is today.
All right, this will have to be the last question.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Lori Dando, mid-career class, 1993. And I hate to close on a Balkans question, but
another Balkans question. Okay.
Sorry about that. Being that, as you stated, Serbia's position was to keep Kosovo an integral part of its territory, and being that the recent settlement seems to put you on two different tracks of entry into the EU, would you describe that as a success in Serbian diplomacy or a failure in Serbian diplomacy? And the fact that we were able to settle that dispute, as you said, without another war, should we take encouragement from that disagreements can be settled peacefully, or are there lessons to be taken away that we can put into practice?
Well, I think that what happened in 2008 with Kosovo declared independence was a very, very, very dangerous potential precedent for the stability of the world. This was the first time that, since we have the International Order of 1945, that somebody tried to generate a statehood out of a unilateral declaration of secession in peacetime, in the absence of agreement in the Security Council. This would have been the first. And a lot of people really took a step back, saying, listen, this is something very dangerous. You know, and the arguments for declaring Kosovo independence, in my opinion, were not very strong, given the dangers. I will always remember a conversation that I had with at the time, with a foreign minister of a major country in the world. I was trying to convince her that that this was not the smartest thing to do. And the minister said, listen, this is I can totally understand what you're saying. Your arguments are very strong, but, you know, Mr. Minister, you need to understand one thing. Kosovo is a special case. And he said, well, who has the right? First of all, who has the right to declare special cases? United States, Russia, US and Russia together, Security Council. I mean, who has the right to declare special cases? Well, okay, you know, this is a grown-up world, so there are some people who are more equal than the other and who can declare special cases. But then I said, what is so special about Kosovo? And she said, well, Mr. Minister, you know, you had an exceptionally brutal dictatorship. I know, by the way. And this dictatorship oppressed an ethnic minority to the point of extreme. It brought about international intervention. And although admittedly this dictator is dead and your country is a democracy, 99% of these people, they no longer want to be a part of your country, and there's nothing you can do about it. And I said, I lost you. You started now talking about Iraq, right? And she was taken aback. I said, you had an extremely brutal dictatorship, not oppressing but gassing an ethnic minority in the north. Saddam is dead. Iraq is a democracy. There was a military intervention, and 99% of Kurds want to break free. Does it mean that you are going to create an independent state of Kurdistan in the north of Iraq? Or are you trying to say that Saddam was actually not that bad, so Iraq doesn't deserve to be partitioned and Serbia does? You see, there are great dangers stemming out of clumsiness in the way you pursue certain things in international relations. My opinion is that the last big mistake, international mistake of the George W. Bush government was to encourage Kosovo to declare independence. It took us, what, 6 years, 7 years to get back to the negotiating table, the negotiations that you refer to. I think that this is the only way to resolve differences. Is this going to be a stop on a train that is going to lead us to the final resolution of this issue successfully? Yet remains to be seen. But this is definitely the way to go down diplomatic path. But you see, after this unilateral declaration of independence, thank God we did not have a war, but it took us 7 or 8 years to get back to the negotiating table. And that's what happens in a good scenario. Imagine something happening in a bad scenario and in a place which is intrinsically more explosive than the Balkans right now. Thank you very much for your question. I was hoping to avoid it.
We on here? Oh, thanks. Thank you so much, Mr. President. Obviously, we all found you quite inspiring and interesting. And an interesting thought for future governance is no one election, no impeachment. But then you have to leave after a year. Very, very interesting. And again, it seems to me that you inspire us not only with the specifics and your use of analysis and so forth, but the fact that you're so willing to speak what's really on your mind and what's really straight. I mean, so much of this world is spent avoiding hard questions, and the fact that you're willing to take them on is a great pleasure. So I just wanted to mention to, just to remind you where we are. We're now going to have lunch and individual class time. Wow. I know that there are certain of you trying to organize, for example, subsets who want to talk about climate change or anything else. Others can work on those kinds of questions. And then at 3 o'clock, there are the alumni awards and reunion presentations and so forth. Class gift presentation. Again, my thanks to your being here. My sadness that I can't be with you this afternoon because of this scheduling conflict on poverty. But I congratulate all of you for your terrific work, and especially thanks again.
See you in 5 years from now. Thank you.
What's that? Okay. So I actually have one quick announcement about the box lunches, if you'll just bear with me. You can grab your lunch behind me in the Forum Cafe area, and there are beverage stations located outside of all the central locations for your classrooms. So please, unless you're on this floor, don't use this beverage station. Our staff is all over to help direct you to your classrooms. But have a great afternoon, and please be back here at 2:55 for the raffle. Very much, Martin. Yep, thank you. Alexander,